Civilization and Its Discontents of Freud is one of my favorite books, and I think it's a great book, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things wrong with it. There is a deep trouble with this book, I think, which I just read, and that is that it depends too much on the analogy between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between the history of man taken as a whole and the history of a single individual, the development of a child into a human being. And that's a very perilous analogy to write a whole book on the basis of.
Many authors use that analogy, by the way.
Of course they do. And whenever they do, it can be evocative and useful, but you better not depend too totally and too wholly upon it. What I'm saying here is that it is possible, even in the case of a very, very great book by a very great author, and there's no question that Freud is one of the great ones. I'm saying that that book is still, it may be criticized, may be judged adversely as well as
favorably.
Favorably, right.
But first, Charles, seems to me, I would like to say for myself at least, that the rules of criticizing a book are really very important to know. Let me give you one illustration. I do a lot of lecturing as well. I not only write books, but I give lectures. And giving a lecture is like writing a book, and listening to a lecture is exactly like reading books, a little shorter, a little more compact. And sometimes, when I know the audience, as I know at St. John's College, where I lecture annually, at the beginning of a discussion period, when I expect the students to be critical, and often hypercritical, often aiming to tear me apart.
Oh, they probably are.
I say to them, now look, you've heard a lecture for the first time, you've heard this matter discussed for the first time. Before you start criticizing me, begin by asking the following question. Mr. Adler, do I understand you to say that? And finish it. Now, either I will
understand you to say
that, and then finish the sentence.
Right.
Now, either I will say, no, that's not what I said, in which case you better let me try again to say what I mean. Only when you have gotten to the point where, having said, do I understand you to say that, I reply by saying, yes, that's exactly what I said, and that's exactly what I mean, are you entitled to go on to criticize? Because understanding what an author or a speaker says is absolutely prior to saying, I disagree with you or I agree with you. It doesn't make any difference whether you say I agree or I disagree. To agree with that which you don't understand is inane, just as much as to disagree with that which you don't understand is impertinent. So if you want to avoid inanity or impertinence, don't say you agree or disagree until you're sure you understand. Now, of course, the lecturer has a chance. I mean, I can make them ask me the question and say, no, I didn't say that, I didn't mean it. But the poor author is often
well, he's at the mercy of your impoliteness.
That's right.
There are certain rules that we might say of intellectual etiquette that are required for any kind of criticism, aren't they? And one of them is this, that you don't have a right to criticize, to agree or disagree, until you really understand the author. Another one is that you should restrain yourself from being disputatious or contentious.
Criticizing just for the sake of criticizing.
That's right. An awful lot of people do that.
I know.
I think
many people say, I've heard people say, I don't know what you're talking about, but I think you're wrong.
Right. And finally, the last rule of intellectual etiquette is that you should know the difference between knowledge and just personal opinion. If you are going to argue with an author, if you're going to disagree with him, you better have reasons other than merely your dislike of what he says or your opinion that it's stupid or something.
When you start to say you're wrong, you've got to give full reasons for saying so. But let me add one other thing. An old friend of mine once said, there's no point in winning an argument when you know you're wrong.
Yeah.
A lot of people do try to win arguments when they know they're wrong. And there may be some point in it practically if money is at stake or position or power. But when understanding is at stake, there's no point in winning the argument when you know you're wrong.
No, because you have definitely lost in that case. There are 4 respects in which an author can fail to discharge all his obligations.
After you understand him.
After you understand him, you have the right to judge him on at least 4 different grounds.
What are they, John?
Well, the first one is that he may be uninformed, and you can, uninformed with respect to some fundamentally important or relevant fact.
Which, if he knew, would change his argument somewhat.
It would change his argument, and you can discover that in reading him and charge him with it.
For example, Darwin was, I think, innocently uninformed about the laws of genetics.
Yeah, sure.
The
He couldn't have known about them. Mendel didn't announce them until 50 years later.
Nevertheless, his lacking information on this score, his not knowing the Mendelian laws of inheritance, is a real defect in the analysis of the origin of species.
Right. And then Aquinas, or Ptolemy, could not have known what Galileo, with his telescope, discovered, namely that the heavenly bodies actually change in all kinds of ways. They thought that heavenly bodies, the stars and so forth, were incorruptible.
Well, they thought, as a matter of fact, they thought that the heavenly bodies, the bodies above the moon, the stars and the sun, only changed in place, that they were subject only to local motion, whereas we know they alter in many, many ways. Aristotle made a similar error when in handling animal reproduction. He thought the male, that was the active factor. In fact, he only knew about the semen. He didn't know about the egg. He thought that the woman, or not woman, but the female of the species, whatever the species was merely the receptacle for the implantation of the positive male factor. He didn't know that. Lacking a microscope, lacking...
In that case, I think he verges on being misinformed, and that's, I think, the second element, or the second respect in which an author can be wrong and on which he can be criticized. I think Aristotle, if he had looked at women a little bit more sympathetically than he did, would have maybe understood that.
I have to correct you. He isn't dealing with men and women. He's dealing with male and female of any species.
Okay, but all right. Listen, I'm not going to argue about Aristotle and women. We could go on
we could
about that at some time. Here, an example of misinformation on the part of an author with regard to a truly relevant piece of information. Take, I mean, the impact of Freud's works when they first appeared on the scene, you know, at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. He pointed out that every book that had ever been written about children up to that time was just totally wrong, because they'd always assumed that children were totally innocent of any sexual feelings.
Like Wordsworth's Trailing Clouds of Glory.
Yes, it's so lovely, isn't it? And yet children, as Freud knew from just looking at them, and as all of us know from looking back into our own childhoods, are very much concerned with sexual matter. And that was an intentional misinformation. I think it's like Aristotle and women.
Well, I won't go into that with you, but in general, this is one kind of criticism then. But you aren't entitled to say that you disagree with an author because you think he's uninformed or because you think he's misinformed, unless you can give chapter and verse. Unless you can say, uninformed about this thing, and I'll show you what the information is, you see.
Yes, you have to be able to provide it yourself.
Now, authors are sometimes make mistakes in logic. Their reasoning is bad, or their inferences are poor. Let me give you an example from an author that I admire and that you admire, Machiavelli. This is all contained in a single sentence, as a matter of fact.
I think I admire him more for his verb than for his logic, but anyway, go ahead.
The sentence is, the chief foundations of all states, new as old or composite, are good laws and good arms. And as there cannot be good laws where the state is not well armed, it follows that where they are well armed, they have good laws.
Oh, what a howling non sequitur.
Non sequitur.
Yeah, right.
It does not follow at all that where they are well armed, they have good laws. Now, that's an extraordinary statement for a man who's as keen as Machiavelli to make.
Yeah.
Now, there's a fourth point that I would say every book is subject, criticism that every book is subject to.
Oh, yeah?
Because man is finite, human authors are finite, and that is, even if an author has made no mistakes of fact, I mean, he's neither misinformed nor uninformed, and if his reasoning is always sound and cogent, never made a slip in logic or a non sequitur, if he's good in all these respects, it is still always possible to say of any author his analysis is incomplete.
Yeah.
Because to say complete would be to say too much. But again, since you can say it of any author, there's no point in saying it unless you say it very specifically and point out the particular incompleteness you're complaining of. Now let me give you an illustration of this. Both the great Italian poet Dante and the great English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes make the point that peace, civil peace, requires government. That where there is no government, there is no peace, because government is the arbiter that settles disputes by appeals to law and adjudication rather than to force. Yet, Hobbes does not go on and draw the conclusion from that premise that Dante draws. Dante says, therefore, if there's going to be peace in the world, if there's going to be world peace, there must be world government. Hobbes goes on to say that since world government, without even conceiving of world government, since sovereigns stand to one another in a state of anarchy, not in a state of government or law, that war between sovereigns is a continual condition.
The tragedy is that Dante said what he said 400 years before Hobbes said what he said. And Hobbes could have learned it from Dante if he couldn't figure it out himself.
It has often occurred to me that, particularly in discussing the great books, reading them and discussing them, that if every later generation had really read and understood the great works of an earlier generation, many errors, many flaws would have been avoided.
Yes,
unfortunately, that isn't true.
Good authors require and deserve good readers, but a good reader helps to make good authors if you demand certain things from them.
To go back again to this illustration I used at the beginning of the lecturer and the audience. I wouldn't have enjoyed giving lectures all my life if I hadn't learned from lectures, and I only learn I hate to give a lecture without a discussion afterwards, without a good discussion that is sort of prefaced by this rule of tell me first that you understand me and then tell me what's wrong with what I've said.
Right.
Because when that's done well, I have learned a great deal. In fact, I've almost always, when I'm planning to write a book, given it in lecture form first, in order to get from an audience exactly that kind of criticism. I understand what you're saying, but don't you see that you made an error here? Or don't you think this is incomplete? In that way, I learn from my readers or audience, as I think one can't learn any other way.
Yes, I think it's true. And yet most authors nowadays are not served in that way by professional critics who should be performing that service for them.
As a matter of fact, I think criticism is at a very low level today.
Yeah.
And I think I know the reason why. I mean, when I read reviews of books that have become bestsellers, let me give you 3 examples. The Greening of America, for example, or Future Shock. Take those 2 for a moment. Praised widely, and praised because of the outrageous things they said. Praised because they made claims and made assertions that were extraordinarily violent in ways. Nevertheless,
and they violated the truth, in your view.
But the point is that the critics never said, is it true?
Yeah.
And I find in much of the criticism I read in the current sheets that the critic does not, first of all, ask about a book, is it true? Is what the author's saying true? Because only after you've said, yes, it's true, does it become significant to say what of it.